Welcome back. In this video, we're going to start looking at all the different shader nodes and a few utility nodes that we can use in the shader editor. Now, we're in a file called the node explanation example file, and you can find that attached to the resources for this lecture. We'll also be using it in the next couple of lectures, and if possible, I would definitely recommend downloading it and having it open as you watch this video, pausing here and there and just experimenting with some of the settings on these different nodes. It's definitely much better to work alongside me, and especially when we get to the challenge, having this Blender file open will allow you to complete the challenges, experiment with different nodes and different settings, and start creating some really awesome shaders. And within this shader, which I've applied to Suzanne, we have every single shader node in Blender, which you can find in Shift A, Shader, and these are all the shader nodes that we can use. And let's just quickly go through some of them. So we use the principled BSDF node for the vast majority of the time. BSDF stands for Bidirectional Scattering Distribution Function, which is a big mouthful, but you don't really need to know what it means. Essentially, it just means how light interacts with a surface. Now, if we compare these limited use nodes with the principled node, we can see a lot of similarities. So first off, in these limited use nodes, they all have a color input. They also, for the most part, have a normal input. The diffuse BSDF node essentially just creates the color of the object. So no matter what roughness we have this at, we don't get any reflections. This is simply just a way to change the color of the object. Subsurface scattering works exactly the same way as in the principled BSDF node. We have a scale instead of an amount. We have a radius, just like we have here, a color, index of refraction, and anisotropy, as well as the normal. And as I said, this just works exactly the same as it does in the principled node. The glossy node is a kind of weird one. So this is what generates reflections. If we take the roughness all the way down, we get a mirror finish. And as we increase that, we get more diffuse reflections up to the point where we essentially just get a diffuse surface. We have a few different settings for that. Sharp gives us sharp reflections no matter the roughness. And we have a few other ones. Multi-scatter is probably the most accurate. It's also the longest to render. I tend to stick with GGX or Beckman for the most part. Anisotropic gives you this effect here. So this is the effect you would see on the bottom of pots and pans, frying pans. It's also similar to what you might see on a vinyl record. And essentially it replicates the idea of having brushed metal in this kind of radial pattern. Now, one thing about this node that we didn't mention when we did a brush metal material with purely the principled node is we have a tangent input. So I've brought in a tangent input node, which you can find under Shift A, Input, under Tangent. And what this does is it lets you decide where you want this radial tangent to be. So at the moment we have this set to radial and Z. So if we look at our axes, you can see Z goes up and down throughout our scene, which is why we have this radius on the top when it's set to Z. If we set it to Y, we should now get this across the Y-axis. So let's just adjust the roughness a little bit so it's a little bit easier to see. I think that's it right at the front there, and let's change it to X. And we should have that on the side here. Let's just adjust this setting just a little bit so it's a bit easier to see. With the anisotropy up a little bit, we can see it on the side there. So that's a way we can use that tangent to adjust where this radius starts. You can also use that directly in the principled node. We have the refraction BSDF. So straight away you might think this looks a little bit like glass, and you would be right. What we're seeing is refracted rays of light going through our object, bounced light that's bending dependent on the surface and the index of refraction. If we turn the roughness up, we get a kind of frosted glass effect. But the one thing that this is missing is we don't get any reflections on our surface. So generally you would combine that with a glossy node in order to create a proper glass material. We have the translucent BSDF, which at first glance looks a bit like subsurface scattering. It's very quick to render, and what it does is it gives you that illusion of a translucent surface. So think about something like maybe jelly or a gummy bear. This is the kind of material you might use to get that effect for fast rendering instead of using subsurface scattering. Emission is another one we've kind of used before. So this gives our surface an emissive quality, which means it will put light into the scene. If I change the strength up a little bit, you can see this is lighting up the ground plane I have here. We'll take this down to about 20. Now, one tip I'll give you when it comes to emission is instead of actually using a color and just picking it from RGB values, try and use something like a black body node or a wavelength node. You can find both of these under Converter, one at the top and one at the bottom. Black body, for instance, takes a temperature value and turns it into a color. So let's plug this into color, and you can see at 1500 degrees, we essentially get the color of the sun, or thereabouts. And that's a really good way of getting a nice sunlight color. You can plug that directly into your sun in your scene, in fact, if you change your light to use nodes. Wavelength, again, works a little bit different. This is based on the nanometer value of light. So for something like 600, we're talking a similar color to this. So let's plug that in. And you can see very similar, a wee bit redder. You have to adjust your wavelengths slightly. If you want to know these temperatures and wavelengths, there are plenty of resources online. I found diagrams for both of these values with a wide range of different colors on Wikipedia. We have the transparent BSDF node, and immediately, as soon as we make our object transparent, we no longer see it. With our value at 1, we essentially make the object invisible. If we change our value down a little bit, we start to see it coming back in. And obviously we're using black here. So once it gets to 0, we just get a black object with no reflections, no diffuse, no real surface information. We can also change the color of this. So you can see with different colors, we get a different effect. So transparency can be useful when combined with, again, other nodes like the glossy node if you want reflections, subsurface scattering, refraction. There are many different options for combining these nodes. And that pretty much takes care of all these nodes that before Blender 2.8 and the introduction of the principled node, we would have to combine in different ways to create the same effect that we can usually just get out the principled node straight out the box. Now we have another couple of nodes I want to talk about. We have the glass BSDF node, which gives us glass. This is essentially just like combining a refraction shader with a glossy shader. So we get our refraction, but we also get our reflections on our surface. The Velvet BSDF is a little bit strange. So the Velvet BSDF allows you to create an effect similar to the sheen setting and the principled BSDF node, but not on its own. We have this value sigma, and at 1, we essentially get this diffuse color on our entire object with only some of the front faces really starting to become dark. As we decrease that sigma value, we get more black. Now that black is not a black color, it's not changing our diffuse color, it's actually just the shader becoming transparent. So the way the Velvet shader would work is you would combine it with a diffuse node to create an effect like velvet or any other cloth material. We have the Toon node, and I'm going to change the color of this to something like blue. And this allows us to create a kind of toon effect. So you can see our highlights are quite stylized here. We can change the size of these highlights. And this is kind of like roughness. So you can see with our size all the way down almost, we get pretty mirror-like reflections on our object. With it all the way down to 0, we get nothing at all. It just goes black. Now, if you can find a happy medium between these, you can start to get some nice painterly type effects. And what I really like with this setting, and I'm just going to make this a little bit lighter. There's some of that painterly effect. What I really like with this toon shader is when we're in glossy mode, and at the moment it looks quite metallic, still a little bit stylized. And if we adjust some of these settings a little bit, maybe increase the smoothness and the size just a little bit, we start to get an effect that still looks quite stylized, still very illustrative, but it's very clearly like a metal object. The next one I want to talk about is the holdout shader. Now this is an interesting one. Let me add a cube into the scene, and I'm just going to move this down and back a little bit in the scene. So at the moment we have this cube in the scene and we have Suzanne. Let's turn this into a holdout, and immediately what you see is it just turns grey. We can't see anything. Now this isn't a shader making our object grey, it's in fact making everything behind that object transparent. So to show that off, let me just open up the render settings. We'll go down to film and we'll turn on transparent, and you can see our background being transparent, and Suzanne is also transparent, but so is everything behind it. So we are essentially holding out this shape from the render. Now this is a really useful tool when you're compositing. This has been superseded by quite an easier workflow. So let's go up to the outliner over here, and I have all my objects apart from Suzanne in one collection and Suzanne in a separate collection. Now what I can do is I can go to my filters here, and in restriction toggles I can turn on holdout, and now in my outliner I have an additional column, and you can see at each collection I have this little circle, and on Suzanne's collection, if I turn that to holdout, and let's just make this a glass BSDF, I can make that a holdout now. So that will affect an entire collection without actually needing to go in and changing the shader on it. So that makes compositing and doing render passes a whole lot easier. Okay, so we just have a few more shaders. We have a couple of hair shaders, which I'm not going to go into. You can always look up those in the Blender manual if you want more information on them. We have some volume shaders as well. So let me grab this material output node and bring it down a little bit. Let's cut the surface of it. And let's first look at the principled volume. And instead of plugging this into surface, we'll plug it into volume. And here you can see we get a kind of smoky effect. So the principled volume is generally used to create mist, fog, smoke, anything like that where you need that kind of volume. This has a lot of settings, so again I would recommend checking out the Blender manual if you want to know more. The main ones here are the colour of the fog and also the density of the fog. We also have volume scatter, which works very similar to principled volume, but again we have a lot less settings here. We just have the density and the colour. With volume absorption, you can fake the way that light is absorbed into something like water in a lake, where as it gets deeper into the water, the less light gets through. So you can essentially have a shader on top of your lake that's like a water shader. You'll get your nice reflections and your refractions, but as you get deeper into the water, you'll see it less and less into that water. So if you have something floating on the surface of the water, you'll be able to see through the water a little bit and see some of what's underneath it. But as you get deeper into that water, that will fall off and you'll see it less and less, and that can be really useful. We have a couple of other nodes I just want to point out. We have the displacement node that lets us turn heights into displacement. You would just plug those into the displacement map. We saw that on the images shader. We have the bump map, which again gets plugged into the normals of any BSDF shader. And the same with normal map, where we take a color normal map and convert it into normal vectors that Blender can read. The final thing here is the combine shaders. So back when we used to use several of these to create a single shader, you would use an add shader or a mix shader to combine those. So let me go into a new material. Let me select my object and add combine shaders. And this is a way that we used to create a couple of different shaders. So here I have old school plastic. And what this is a diffuse shader and a glossy shader combined. we use a Fresnel node, which picks out the parallel faces from the front-facing faces. Send it through a colour ramp node just to adjust the values. And now we get a diffuse shader that has reflections. The same is true for this old school glass, which has a refraction shader giving us our refractions, but also a glossy shader giving us our reflections. And again, I've just used a different node this time for the mix. This is the Fresnel setting on a layer weight input node. And finally, we have this old school cloth. So as I said, with the Velvet BSDF node, this can be layered on top of a diffuse node to get those nice white highlights on the edges. So it's challenge time once again, and this is a bit of a tricky one. So your challenge for this video is just to experiment with some of those different shader nodes. And again, you have that example file attached to the resources for this lecture, and just see what kind of effects you can create. Try mixing 2 different shader nodes together, or even 3 or 4 using the mix shader or add shader nodes. And remember, you can daisy chain as many mix shaders together as you want. So have a go at that and see what you can come up with. Maybe you'll stumble across a really nice shader. And remember, if you do, give it a name, mark it as an asset, and make sure that the Blender file is in your asset browser folder. Join me in the next video. See you then.